Hello and welcome back to this video on DevTest Labs again, but this time slightly different topic. Um, Over the last videos, a couple of videos that you've seen, we've talked a lot about the automation capabilities within DevTest Lab. The one thing I want to emphasize here is that the automation that you perform within the DevTest Lab is not just locked down to the DevTest Lab. It'd be such a waste of resource if you spend all this time creating these wonderful ARM templates to provision environments for you, but you had no way of extracting them from the DevTest Lab and using them to provision real production kind of setup. Now, the concept of BYOT, bring your own template, just exactly solves that problem, where you can either bring the generic Azure templates that you have into the DevTest Lab and equally take the DevTest Lab templates and provision them outside of DevTest Labs. Bring your own template was a feature that was introduced, well, not too long ago, but it's made DevTest Labs a lot more popular with people. So we'll jump right into a demo and we'll look at the capabilities of bring your own template. We'll pick up one of the templates that I have within my GitHub repository, and then we will look at creating a pipeline within VSTS to provision an environment using it. And as part of the environment provisioning process, you can see that you're just not logged down to DevTest Lab. You could use that to provision the template pretty much anywhere within Azure. Okay, so I'm going to flip right into the demo. Okay, so I'm going to navigate into VSTS. Now, if you didn't know, VSTS is accessible from within Azure portal. So you can look for team services or team projects, and as long as your team services account is associated to the same identity that you're accessing VSTS with, you'd be able to you'd see it showing up here. So in this case, I'm just going to select the team services account, and I should hopefully see the list of all the team services accounts that are associated to this identity. There we go. The AVA DevOps TAAR is the one that I'm going to use for this demo. I'll click this and then click on the link here, and then it takes me right into the instance. But from the Azure portal, the commercials are enabled. So if you wanted to purchase more build minutes or more user licenses, then that can also be done right from within Azure portal. So I'm within the VSTS instance, team services as it's called these days. I can click to create a new project. Let's call this IAC Training Demo 02. Select a repository, select a process, and click Create. And in a couple of minutes' time, the project will be created and ready to use. All right, so the team project has been created. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize the Git repository and select an ignore file for this Git repository. Just initializing my Git repository here, and we're good. Now I'm going to go into the build section, and this is what I will use for leveraging continuous integration. I have the option of creating a new definition here. So let's select this option. You get this really nice form where you could select to create an empty build definition or choose from templates that are already available for you. So if you wanted to deploy, for example, a cloud service, then a ready-made template is available for you to just pick up and apply. What we'll do is we'll start off with an empty process so we can cover off some of the other details. When I select that, the first option I get is to select a source. Now, this is quite amazing here, this bit, the get sources. Not only can I pull sources from within VSTS, but I can actually leverage the CI/CD system that's available within Team Services with GitHub, with a private Git repo that I may be hosting myself, or with a subversion system that I may be hosting myself. Now, in this case here, I'm going to select GitHub. And of course, I just need to authenticate myself. So let's create a GitHub connection. I'm going to just authorize behind the scenes. It's going to do the heavy lifting of generating the auth token, making sure that a service endpoint gets selected. Okay, it needs to authenticate, but it needs more detail to authenticate. Right, so I'm going to have to give it a token. Let's try if this token works. Okay, so let's see if we can. There we go. This is the repository. And again, it asks me which branch I want to associate. Um, let's just double checking that this is the right repository. Yeah, that's the right repository. That's the right branch. So we're pretty much connected with GitHub, which means not only can I trigger the build and pull the sources from GitHub, but I can actually set this up as a continuous integration build. Now, what that means is if I go into triggers and set this as CI, every time I do a commit in GitHub on this branch in this repository, VSTS will trigger a CI process. Isn't that spectacular? It's event driven, so tools that are outside the scope of VSTS, the open source tools outside the scope of VSTS, can also leverage the wonderful CI/CD system that's available within VSTS. So going back into the task section, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a task for resource group deployment. Click Add, and within this resource group deployment, I'm going to select the Azure subscription that I want to deploy the resource to. So I'm simply going to select the IDC PDC subscription that I have. Let's call it Azure ISC subscription. OK. It's just behind the scenes doing the communication, integration, generating the token, authenticating, authorizing. All of that is abstracted away. You don't have to worry about it. Once that's done, you click refresh and select the Azure ISC subscription. It says, what action do you want to perform here? Do you want to create a resource group or do you want to update a resource group? But you've got a lot more options than that. You could, in theory, run the same process to start VMs within that resource group, switch off VMs, delete virtual machines, and it's quite useful because you could have separate build definitions that can run different times of the day. For example, in the morning to provision stuff, in the afternoon to just validate that their state is the same as when it was originally provisioned, and then at the end of the day, run a scheduled job from here, which simply deletes the VMs that are not being used. So in this case, we'll stick with create or update resource group. I'm going to have to give it a resource group name, so let's just call it, let's just follow the same convention, IEC training, VSTS demo, and select a location. So let's select West Europe. Template location, well, the template is coming from the Git repository. See, I can even browse and see my Git repository here. I can see the folders and where the files are right from within VSTS. So I'm going to select the template, which is the IAS2VM SQL 1VM template. And then I'm going to just select the Azure deploy.json file. And then I'm going to also have to specify a parameter file. Although it's optional, I could pass the parameter file in here because it's got values I need injecting as part of the deployment process. But you don't really have to specify it if you don't need to. So let's select the parameter file here. And then if there are certain parameters that you wanted to override, then you could do that by the space that's provided here. And the deployment modal is incremental. So it's just going to run and make sure that if there are any deltas from what the template dictates, then it bridges the gap. The rest of the stuff I'm going to leave as is. Save this build definition and queue a build. And let's just call this build definition something before we queue it. Let's call it, let's just quickly rename it. Click on rename and call it demo.deployment. Click OK. Now I'm going to queue the definition here. It's going to run using the VSTS hosted agent. See, the other benefit of doing this is, I didn't have to set up a build system myself. I didn't have to install all the versions of PowerShell and ARM and Azure SDK. It's all just offered as a service. So, your time to market significantly gets reduced because of that. So it's just queuing a build. In essence, what it's doing behind the scenes is making a connection to the hosted agent, taking the extract of the build and all the settings, passing that over, and then the build agent's just simply going to run through the steps and orchestrate them in the order that they've been specified. So first off, it's done a git clone. It's taken down the repository. from GitHub. It's just going through the Azure Resource Group deployment process now. So if I go into the Azure portal, and within the Azure portal, if I click on resource groups and search for whatever I had called that, which was IC training, VSTS, there you go. Well, it's just starting to provision the resource group. And if we look at it, it's a complex template that's not only provisioning VMs, but going the full mile with NSG rules, availability sets, public IP addresses, and it's just provisioning it now. So, if we go into the deployment section here, we can see that the deployment activity is happening. So not only can you see the updates, but it's incremental updates. So the messaging is quite good from that point of view. So if things fail, you have a clear order of how you got there, what the inputs and outputs were. So this will run for about 5-7 minutes because it's got a lot of resources to deploy, and we'll continue. We'll leave it running. While this is running, there's another thing that I wanted to show you. In the last video, I talked about creating a pipeline that allows you to, spin up environments, run some tests on those environments, maybe run a DSC script or two to check the configuration of that environment, and on the back of that, run some tests. And then when you're satisfied with the test, simply snapshot the environment and then delete the environment. So I'm going to show you a pipeline that I've already constructed, which kind of does that. It's really just to open you up to the ideas of what you can achieve with DevTest Labs. In this release definition here within VSTS, what I've done is I've created one environment called staging, and I've used some of the out-of-box tasks that are provided by DevTest Labs. Now, if you don't see these tasks within your VSTS subscription, nothing to panic. Simply browse to the VSTS marketplace and look for Azure DevTest Lab. And there you go. It's got over 1,000 downloads, quite well rated. And if you click install here, it gives you an option to install this free task to your VSTS subscription. Just select your Azure subscription. Because it's already installed on mine, there's no point in me selecting to do that again. But then when it kind of does the installation behind the scenes and then makes this task available within your task library. So when you now go into the task library and within the task library go into the deploy section, you'll be able to see the Azure DevTest Lab tasks. And these tasks are quite well-purposed here. For example, create VM would provision the VM for you. Delete VM would delete the VM. And the create custom, really, I mean, these are the 3 operations you would probably want to perform from VSTS. So very, very relevant. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. I've taken the ARM definition. I've put it in my GitHub repo, Git repo here. So I'm just specifying the endpoint of that. Let me gain some real estate back so I can show you the actual values here. So let's go back into the code section. And let's select. So this is the actual template. And I've just simply specified the endpoint of that template here. I'm specifying a bunch of parameters. Again, VSTS gives you a way of storing these parameters as variables. You have the option of encrypting them. So, if you're putting in passwords here, they're not showing up as plain text. Going back to environments, I'm just specifying the lab that this needs to be deployed to. After that, in my pipeline, I'm just running a DSC script, which does certain health checks on the server that's provisioned. It copies my software, i.e. my package, onto the server. And then it simply sets up IAS bindings, deploys IAS, configures the binding, the IP address, the app pool, deploys the actual website, and then it starts the execution of tests. Now, at this point, my environment's provisioned, my application software is deployed, my automated tests are running. And then once it finishes the test execution, you can introduce an optional step, which is a manual intervention. So if you needed to have someone manually log on to the server to do some more smoke testing or any kind of health checks, then this is a way to execute a certain pipeline, wait for a little bit, and then move to the rest of the pipeline execution. So once these health checks are done, the next thing it does is it simply creates an image, puts it in the DevTest Lab custom image library, and then deletes the VM. So over a process of 30, 40 minutes, you've tested the automation, you've run your health checks, you've run the automated tests, and now you have a custom image that you can go back to should there be a problem that you needed to investigate. So, just wanted to give you an idea of how you can leverage dev test labs for various scenarios for purposes of testing. So going back into the actual resource deployment, the resource deployment is still happening. If we flip into the Azure portal, we can see it's probably got a lot more resources in here now. Let's click on Overview. It's got, the list is growing. It's probably deploying the SQL PaaS and the SQL IaaS instance now. So we'll just give it a few more minutes to complete deployment. All right, so the build's completed. As we can see here that the Azure deployment, Azure Resource Group deployment successfully completed. It's green. So if I flick back to the Azure portal and refresh it, I can see my SQL Server IaaS instance deployments completed, my virtual networks provision, NSG rules provision, public IP, storage, all of that in under 8 minutes using an ARM template that is provisioning that I created as part of setting up my dev test lab. And then I'm using that template to provision stuff outside the dev test lab as well. Okay, so if I go back in here now, in this environment, I've got an endpoint, which is my way into interacting with the web application that's hosted on the IaaS instances. I think it's this one or the load balancer, web server public IP address. So if I take this DNS now, I could actually come back into my pipeline here and further build on it, where after deploying the environment, I can add another task in there to maybe do some load testing or some ping testing, availability testing, or load. Yeah, I think that's the one, cloud load test. So I can just simply specify um, um, the load test that I want to run, and then from that point onwards, to specify a few more settings. And then after the environment's provision, it will use the endpoint and then run some tests on it. So, this is the theme that we've been talking about over the last few videos is you're starting to bring your infrastructure operations team into the same tools and to the same processes as that used for development. And when they converge into single pipelines, then, and they're working in collaboration, it's very, very easy to identify configuration drift and bad things that happen usually later on in the application lifecycle. You're just pushing that left now. And when you can identify stuff quicker, you can fix it quicker. And that's the whole goal. So, just to recap, Azure Dev Test Labs allow you the acceleration to set up environments for development. Give your CIOs and your security folks peace of mind, so they don't have to worry about runaway costs. They don't have to worry about things like exposing networks, because they can set up the governance layer for you. For your developers, it gives them a way of getting environments very quickly, but automating from day one. And then for your operations team, they can take that automation and use it for their benefit using the same tools to deploy to non-dev test environments as well, all the way to production.